Well, thanks for having me. Like Glenn said, I've been working with lakes for a number of years now, and I used to do microphones, but a little bit of a reiteration of what Dave True spoke to today. I'm going to give the high-level Science 101 presentation about some of the monitoring that's been conducted, some of the terminology, so that people with less experience and knowledge of lakes can understand some of the terms and jargon around technology that we're going to be discussing. Go on from there. In terms of the science, an introduction to this presentation. As Glenn has mentioned, it's a two-part presentation. The first part is very high-level kind of science overview of our state of knowledge generally across the region. Just to build awareness with various stakeholders and interested parties that either work or play or within these watersheds that also to look at some of the behaviors that may improve water quality in the future. So this has been a long-standing issue. I think Dave mentioned that he started working on this in '76, and that's 1 year before I was born, so that's quite a long time. I'm a little newer to the topic, but I've seen quite a few reoccurring themes here over time. So we'll move on from there. Some of the issues, there's increasing pressure around lakes. These are popular areas. People like to recreate and live by water bodies. And there's been increasing pressure due to land use development. This has resulted in changes in water quality. Okay, so intensive land use has contributed to some of this external loading that results in quite apparent internal loading, and you see these seasonal fluctuations in algal blooms at various central Alberta lakes. It's also not quite as apparent in the contemporary record. A lot of the intensive monitoring in Alberta commenced around 1980s. We do have some long-term lake network locations that have very good data. Unfortunately, for some of the other lakes, it's not as consistent over time. So there are 4 lakes where we have annual seasonal monitoring. Other lakes, it's more opportunistic and planned according to need, but try to revisit some of these more populated lakes on about a 3 to 4 year period. There's also climatic variability, which affects lake water quality and lake water level. And these are one of the issues that we've heard quite a lot over time in dealing with various stakeholder groups. These lakes are subject to seasonal changes resulting from changes in hydrology and also the climatic effects due to warmer water temperatures. Okay, in terms of some of the changing behaviors, why is this an important topic? In terms of safeguarding water supplies, is one of the issues that comes about regularly from stakeholders. These recreational needs around lakes is quite apparent. So this is a place where a lot of social value, cultural value around lakes to recreate. Reduce some of these waterborne health issues. So maintaining beach quality, water quality, fish quality for consumption. It's been a recurring theme that we often see when dealing with lake stewardship groups. Conserve habitat for both plants and animals, and also look at enhancing property values around lakes. So David mentioned there is quite an economy around lakes due to development and needs for industrial purposes and municipalities rather. So the tourism industry is quite a booming industry. We don't have a lot of lakes in Alberta, so that's one consideration, that these are quite heavily used water bodies. Some of the activities you might be familiar with in terms of lake recreation and activities that occur around lakes that can affect water quality, and some of the aesthetic and recreational values. And I won't go through them all in detail because you're familiar with a lot of these activities occurring in central Alberta lakes. But agriculture, cottage development, intensive cottage development, and how the cottage and summer villages are developed in proximity to the lake. Of course, we have lakes around here that are subject to industrial impacts. Walden Lake is one example. And there's been quite a change in terms of some of the industrial pressures at Walden to date. But nonetheless, they still occur. Recreational activities, boating, changes to shoreline or modifications to shorelines can affect riparian health and increase loading to lakes. Shoreline modifications is kind of a byproduct of recreational land use development in proximity to water bodies. In terms of science, and, so that's the high-level overview. In terms of science and legislation, so just the presentation outline again. First part is the high-level science. Second part is the legislation. So I'll get right into some of the terminology around water quality. Dave touched on a lot of this in his presentation, but I'll just get into it a little more detail about the monitoring programs we maintain in Alberta. So water quality, there are a number of different metrics that we measure. They can be broken down into 4 different groups: physical indicators, chemical indicators, biological, and trophic status. So I'll just get into a little more detail on the next slide about the physical indicators. So there's a couple that we look at specifically in Alberta related to water quality, or clarity rather. It's important to note that a number of different factors can affect water clarity in Alberta. The amount of algae, the amount of suspended sediments. In large part, generalization is that a lot of central Alberta lakes are quite murky. So water clarity, for the most part, is somewhat poor. Water temperature is an important factor to measure. It's subject to seasonal variation. Can affect aquatic life and its ability to metabolize. Fish species have optimal temperature ranges, so species composition and community composition of aquatic animals can vary with changes or exceedances of specific temperature tolerances. Dissolved oxygen is another one that's regularly monitored in Alberta. It's required for respiration and is utilized by fish species. Again, one of these parameters that, if lowered to critical levels, can result in fish kills, which we routinely see in Alberta lakes. It can be caused by addition of additional nutrients from external land use practices. So these fish kills, in some instances, are caused by depression of oxygen levels under ice conditions. So through the decomposition, bacterial decomposition of organic matter. So there's 3 that I'm going to talk about briefly. pH is another chemical measurement that we take routinely at lakes. And it's just it just refers to the presence of hydrogen ions in waters. Healthy lakes has a specific range. It's much the same as with temperature and dissolved oxygen content. Alkalinity is just the ability of the lakes to buffer acid deposition. More important for some of the northern lakes where there's less buffering capacity, but it's related to the calcium carbonate levels in water. So ability to neutralize acids when deposited from the atmosphere. Conductivity and salinity is a measure of dissolved ions in water, and changes made related to changes in nutrient budgets or balances, and lake water quantity. So this is kind of the high-level general description of central Alberta lakes, considering a lot of these different factors that we've measured through time. So we see some patterns in terms of lake water quality in Alberta. Relative to these measures, so we talked about the physical and chemical measurements. Most of the lakes in central Alberta are shallow, turbid, warm, alkaline, productive, and capable of sustaining a number of different aquatic species and fish species. So that's kind of the takeaway from the monitoring completed today. In terms of biological measurements, monitored less routinely than some of our physical and chemical measurements. However, we on occasion evaluate sediments, aquatic invertebrates, and these metrics or indicators are used to assess level of aquatic ecosystem health. We've made enhancements to certain lake programs that Alberta Environment maintains to include metals and some other biological kind of proxy indicators. On occasion, we also evaluate fish tissue as it relates to consumption guidelines and in partnership with Alberta Health Services, and other parameters that may affect the growth or reproduction of fish species. As it relates to the fish consumption or tanking considerations, Alberta Health typically puts out advisories related to consumption of fish. However, Alberta Environment on occasion collects the data to support those evaluations with respect to consumption guidelines and exceedances of those guidelines. To the next slide. In terms of, it's kind of a division of labor, so to speak, in terms of some of the monitoring data and evaluation as it pertains to certain jurisdictions. And this maybe speaks to some of the issues that David's bringing up, that it is kind of a division in terms of some of the responsibilities, not both at the provincial government level, but at the municipal level as well. So in terms of evaluation of the monitoring data, different areas or ministries have different responsibilities to evaluate and speak to the various considerations. In terms of fish population statistics, our department, as you may well be aware, recently merged with the Ministry of Sustainable Resource Development. So now that's internalized. In the past, we relied on that ministry, that independent ministry, to help us evaluate some of the trends in community structure as it relates to fish and fish management. Now that the two ministries are merged, there's better internal discussion and reporting and awareness because of our integration into a single ministry. In terms of fish habitat, the DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, is responsible for assessing fish habitat. There's been some discussion that those responsibilities may be transferred onto the province, but for the time being, those assessments as it relates to specific works are still conducted and assessed by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. 10 minutes. In terms of recreational health concerns, as I mentioned before, Alberta Health Services provides the advisories and updates information related to beach closures or status of fish tainting studies. State of lakes in terms of biological measurements relative to human health factors. Lakes in Alberta are generally safe, so these are some general statements. We do on occasion have beach closures, so that should be noted. And we do have advisories related to certain parameters, specifically mercury for fish consumption on certain water bodies throughout central Alberta. As I had mentioned, there are certain parameters that we don't routinely monitor. Bacteria, pesticides, and metals are measured intermittently. And in the studies that we have conducted, these parameters are generally low, with the exception of nearshore bacterial kind of estimates. Contaminants, fish contaminant testing has been relatively poor in terms of provincial programs. We've, in some instances, undertaken additional studies to try to update the information that was available in the North Saskatchewan Basin. I think the last study that was completed, and I've been working on enhancing that evaluation, was completed in the 1980s. But it's not amenable to a trend assessment, so it's really just a snapshot of existing conditions. Beach closures are relatively rare in Alberta, central Alberta. So trophic status lakes is affected by a number of different activities, both natural processes and human activities. And the classification is kind of split into various boxes. So we have low productivity or oligotrophic lakes, and there's 4 categories. Highly productive lakes are very green, is termed eutrophic, and extremely productive is called hypereutrophic. So having said that, we have this range and gradient of productivities in central Alberta, but plant life requires nutrients to a degree. So we have a number of different proxy indicators that help us assess the level of productivity. And in this case, we have phosphorus as a typical measurement to give us an indication of productivity, and we can then put the classification or lake classification, trophic status, into one of those categories based on the level of nutrients. Chlorophyll A is also a proxy indicator. It's simply a ubiquitous pigment that's common to plants and algae. So in terms of some of the pie charts, next slide, or this specific pie chart related to the trophic status of Alberta lakes, this clearly indicates that the largest proportion of lakes are in those last few highly productive categories. So a large proportion, on the order of 36%, are in the hypereutrophic category, and eutrophic about 25%. So a good proportion of central Alberta lakes are highly productive. To a lesser degree, we don't see very clear low chlorophyll, low algae, total phosphorus lakes within this region. In terms of recreational lake productivity, we've done considerable monitoring over time to characterize and quantify the level of nutrients in the lakes and the response variables, in this case chlorophyll A. So having been a part of the Central Alberta Recreational Lakes group, we kind of summarized some of the information. But we do have a range in this specific area, still been having the better water quality than some of the other lakes, such as Lac Lenon. And it just really shows that lake productivity can vary through time and in space in Alberta. But just taking these water quality measurements doesn't necessarily give you enough information to attribute where the nutrient contributions are originating from. So whether they're from sediments, or the natural geology, or from human-related activities. So you need to create additional information through development of nutrient budgets, and that was talked about in greater detail by Dave. I think this is an important slide. We've done a number of different updates recently to look at trends in terms of lake water quality. And there's quite an effort by Richard Casey, one of our co-workers in the policy branch, to evaluate trends of a number of different parameters for the available monitoring data. As I had mentioned before, a lot of this data is more or less limited to the last 20, 30 years, and may or may not be that, well, it was subject to trend assessment, but didn't indicate that there was a lot of deterioration over the last 30 years or so. But there are different tools to look at changes over time, and interestingly, we've done a number of studies, and there's a reference at the bottom here to our Info Center reference, and it's called paleolimnology. And it's simply a reconstruction of lake productivity over time. It has been completed for a number of different lakes, and I've listed up there the work that was done at Lac St. Anne, Pigeon, Pine Lake, Macman, and Wadman. We're looking to enhance this with doing additional reconstructions of lake productivity, but the takeaway was that land use practices have contributed to the deterioration of water quality. The monitoring data we currently have doesn't really support that conclusion, but when you go back further in time, prior to European settlement, there is a very clear enhancement of productivity of lakes in central Alberta. So we're already working with kind of a deteriorated state. That said, it does point to the need for kind of policy development to enhance that, that we are able to design, develop, and deliver watershed management plans. And of course, the greatest consideration is the nutrient the nutrient issue and lake water quality. So if you have time, take a look at that. As I mentioned, we're going to be doing additional reconstructions at probably Walman and Pigeon Lake this coming summer. Kind of went over this again, just kind of reiterating that lakes are naturally productive, and the productivity is a result of various activities, atmospheric deposition, external loading from land use activities, inputs from tributaries, as well as the internal loading contribution. Our lakes, however, are very quick to respond to the availability of additional nutrients. As you see, we go through seasonal variability in terms of algal production. At most lakes, in spring, our lakes are clear and cold, and as the summer progresses and the temperatures warm, we see the release of those phosphorus elements from the sediments, which contribute to the algal blooms. So we go through these seasonal cycles through time. So again, there's some more of a summary of some of our findings to date. A lot of these changes in water quality have already occurred, and our contemporary monitoring record isn't picking up additional changes. If we go back in time, you'll see it's quite apparent that deterioration of water quality has already occurred. And that occurred probably around the 1960s, according to the reconstructed records. So it may not give a true picture of the conditions and level effects on lake water quality today. Doing trend assessment requires quite a comprehensive monitoring data set to evaluate the data. With limited records and limited monitoring, we don't have the ability in some instances to assess change. So these reconstructive tools are giving some indication that water quality has changed over time, and it may be an opportunity or time to start to develop tools to ensure that we maintain or improve current conditions. In some instances, we are in a restoration or remediation phase of trying to improve water quality. So if there is a philosophical kind of policy, maybe statement around expectations related to lake management, it might be a goal or higher level goal maybe to maintain or improve water quality. Just very brief, last slide. I've heard a number of concerns related to lake water quality, or quantity rather, over time in my time with the ministry. These water levels are based on a number of different factors, but largely due to the balance between precipitation and evaporation. We've seen regionally there's been kind of a deficit in terms of water contributions. In some cases we've seen the lake water levels respond quite rapidly to quite short episodic events in terms of precipitation events. And a perfect example was an event at Walman Lake about 2006, where we saw recovery and enhancement of lake water levels to almost their historic maximum within a 4 or 5 day period. So over a relatively short time, you can get quite substantial changes in water quantity. Having said that, when this presentation was first drafted about three years ago, we did an assessment to evaluate water level changes in Central Alberta lakes, and we found that close to half had no trends, so no discernible trends in water level. The other half, on the other hand, showed a deficit, a decreasing trend over time, where data was available. And the other lower percentage of lakes showed that there was actually an increasing trend. So kind of leads us to conclude that there was a regional water deficit over a certain period of time that led to these decreases in terms of water level. But it is quite complicated science as well, and you have to do a mass balance in terms of contributions and losses throughout the watershed to do accurate scientific water balances for lakes. But they are the foundation for the development of nutrient budgets, which I should mention is, one of these tools that can greatly enhance our understanding of where there are opportunities to manage water quality in lakes in Alberta.